Welcome back after this small and short break. And right now we will have the closing keynote of the first day of NoNameCon conference. The day was full of talks. We had the talks about cyber attacks on countries. We discussed Ukraine and Georgia. We had debates about security and how different governmental and private sectors handle security. We had pretty detailed technical talks about browsers, about software for like red teaming, let's call it this way. And now we have a very special event, something that we even didn't expect to happen. And here with me, we have Mr. Bruce Schneier. Of course, everyone, I'm sure that everyone who is like listening and watching us, you know the guy, right? Because like for me, for example, I read the applied cryptography book, like really when I was like in university, probably like 10 years ago or something. And, like everyone knows that Mr. Schneier has written a lot of books. He has a blog, like a blog with many readers that read all cool, like everyday posts about things happening in security world. And I'm more than happy that Mr. Schneier agreed to have this interview with us. On the second side, we have Ruslan Kyanchuk, Mr. Ruslan Kyanchuk, let's put it this way, who is a security software engineer. And Ruslan, you might also know Ruslan because he is an active member of our community. And the funny thing that Ruslan, when he was still in Ukraine, he actually took part in creating, like co-creating of these national Ukrainian cryptographic standards of the cipher called Kalina, which was basically adopted later as a national standard in 2015. So Ruslan knows a lot about cryptography and software development, and this is a cool mix, and I'm so happy that we will have this interview right now. So, guys, stage is yours, and I am disappearing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anastasia. You're an expert in epic introductions, so I appreciate that. Indeed, we have Mr. Schneier here, who I think for sure, if you consider yourself an InfoSec professional, you definitely know who it is. Mr. Schneier, I think this is the first time you're at an event in at a Ukrainian cybersecurity event. Is that right?
I think that's right. I've definitely been to Kiev before, but not for a HackerCon.
Okay, great. So welcome to Ukraine. Even though this is all virtual, but at least we don't have long flights and jet lags.
I know, but I miss traveling so much. Today it's been 176 days since I've been on an airplane.
You're keeping track.
I'm keeping track, which is longer than any other time in my adult life.
I can imagine that. Yes, well, hopefully, we'll certainly talk about pandemic in our interview as well. But hopefully, everyone will carry on safe through this. And with challenges, it also provides some opportunities. So I appreciate you joining us today. Before we start, I'd like to remind our viewers that you can post questions in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure to address them near the end. For many professionals, like I said, Bruce Schneier has always been this renowned cryptographer and well-known security expert. But basically, after all, the applied cryptography that Nastya mentioned was written and already released before I learned to read. So
27 years ago, 1994.
Yes, 3, right? Oh, 94.
3. No, you're right. 1993.
The blue edition.
The first edition was released.
Yes, so, but it will, even though it seems like it's always been the case, it hasn't, right? Everything has a start. So your career also had to start somehow. And there is less information on that in the blogs and the interviews you already have online. Could you tell us a little bit how you started in the field, what brought you to cryptography and security in general, and what were your very first small successes that yet made you feel that this is what you want to do?
So I was always interested in cryptography, even as a kid, secret codes, and there are kids' books on cryptography, and I read them. So it was always an interest of mine. And what happened in 1991, I think it was, that I got laid off from a job. and I started writing for computer magazines. And I wrote different articles for magazines like Mac Week and InfoWorld, I think was the name of it. These computer magazines. And I wrote about many topics, but also about security and cryptography, a little bit here and there. For a magazine called Dr. Dobbs Journal. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It was an old programming magazine for programmers. And from that, I decided to write a book on cryptography, to write applied cryptography, because no book existed for the typical programmer who wanted to program some of this stuff. So I took the articles I wrote and wrote a proposal, and John Wiley and Sons, that's a computer publisher. They're still around today. They still publish some of my stuff. They bought the proposal, and I wrote the book, and it was published in 1993, which if you think about it, was sort of a very fortuitous time, because at that point, the internet was just really becoming a general purpose, general interest tool that everyone was on. And there was this great excitement about security. So here you are, all these programmers trying to write different programs. Mine was the book that explained cryptography. So it became, as weirdly as it sounds, a bestseller. It sold over 100,000 copies, which is crazy. And so that was 93. I wrote a second edition in 95. And depending on, if you have the red cover, that's the second edition, 95. You have the blue cover, that's the very old first edition, 93. And, that started everything.
I think there's now also a 20-year renewed edition. Is that right?
It was a 25-year edition, 25. But I didn't change anything. The only thing different is the cover.
I see.
So
Smart.
So it's not a new edition. It is they call it a new edition, but it's the same book. Don't buy it if you have the red cover. If you just want it. And there are
something
over. I can actually go get it and pull it up if you want to see them. But and that just started everything. It was really that book allowed me to write more, to start consulting, to start my companies, and really launched me as an expert in this field. And it really was because no one else had written that book. I wanted to read it, so I had to write it. And it happened really at that very lucky time when everything was starting to explode on the internet.
So your book is probably the first ones that try to close the gap between academic, cryptography and computer science, and more applied, just regular, typical software engineer who was just to implement something and secure some communication channels or software or storage. But I think that the gap was so tremendous that we still see books today written with the same purpose and still being pretty popular. So it's great that you started this tradition.
So the later book I wrote was Cryptography Engineering, which I wrote with a couple of co-authors. And that is much more modern and bridges that gap. I always recommend Ross Anderson's book, Security Engineering. It's like this thick. It's phenomenal. And it's not just cryptography. It goes into so many aspects of security. And if there's one book I tell people to get if they're in this field, it's Security Engineering. Not just because you can actually cause damage if you hit somebody with it. It really is a good book. And he's coming out with, I think, a third edition. And he's been putting the chapters online. So you can search for Ross Anderson's webpage, and I think they'll be up for another few weeks before he takes them down. Go get them. Download the chapters of the third edition. You kind of want to buy the book also because you want to have the physical object. Having them as the chapters as PDFs is also valuable, and they are available on the internet right now with his permission. This is not shady in any way. He really wants people to have these chapters, but he'll keep them up as long as the publisher allows him to.
And generally having something electronic form is always more convenient when you try to look for something.
Right. Searching is better electronically, reading is better on paper. And the math is just, you want to see it on paper. But yes, to search for keywords, nothing beats a PDF.
That is true. In terms of training, though, so like to write a book, right, you first need to accumulate some knowledge. So did you have a formal training? Was it a university, or you taught yourself? How was it back in the day? Of course, right now there is plenty of information, but how did you come to this?
Yeah, so I do. I mean, I got an undergraduate degree in physics and a graduate degree in computer science. But really, cryptography was something I taught myself. I mean, there wasn't a lot out there. There were 3, 4 books. There were some academic papers. The crypto and Eurocrypt conferences were really just starting. The first ones of those was 1982, 83. So you might have had a decade of conferences, but only 2. Or maybe there was a 3rd European conference. There was very little out there. And it was interesting because in applied cryptography, I was able to really talk about everything. The state of cryptography in the mid-90s is in that book, the entire thing. And that's impossible today because there's so much. But back then it was small enough. And that's why the modern books do a lot more curation than I did, figuring out which ideas they should talk about and which they don't. And there are many, you're right, there are many books today. There are math books, there are computer science books, there are popular books, because this is a fundamental technology for the digital world in a way that we only just imagined in the mid 90s. You're right, there's a lot out there.
Yes, right now I think the bigger problem is there are too many books, so you want to pick which one is actually worth the time reading because you don't have time to read everything now.
And I usually recommend Ross Anderson's book and then my Cryptography Engineering. Those are the 2 I'll recommend to start. And there are others, and I have recommendations on my website.
Absolutely. Speaking of your website and the blogs that you publish for decades now, there's one section there that stands out in terms of the material provided, and that is Friday Squid blogging. So could you tell us a little bit how did you become interested in Squids, why Squids, and yeah.
All I usually say is that every Friday there's a post about squid.
So, but I mean, among all of the species that we have.
Well, it's Friday. That's what we do on Friday.
Okay, makes sense. I guess that's before.
Right?
Sorry?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay. Because that's, gets posted in the morning before you can have alcohol. I think, yeah, squids make perfect sense.
That's right. And here we are in a pandemic, and we're all cooking more. So sometimes I'll post recipes.
Yes, there are also restaurant reviews. So your blog has a lot to offer, also aside from cryptography. That's true. But we're gonna move a little bit towards cryptography this time, trying to kind of follow your career path here. At the beginning, I think your primary focus was indeed cryptography. That's what got you excited, I think. And you've developed multiple ciphers and algorithms. One of them is Ciphers that got submitted to the advanced encryption standard process, now that we know as IAS. We also had, as Anastasia mentioned, we also had recently a competition for the national encryption standard in Ukraine. And in 2015, we adopted a new cipher that replaced the Soviet GOST 28147. I know you're aware about it from your blog post about the cipher. What happened after the announcement that we adopted this new cipher and there was an open competition? Is we got a lot of comments, and there are also even few of those on the blog post of yours that the idea is that Ukraine should have just used some existing algorithm, something that's already well studied, developed by the other countries and maybe internationally standardized. Why would you waste time on reinventing the wheel, as some people say, or rolling your own crypto in your own country, which doesn't have that much history of cryptology research compared to like Belgium or United States or Britain. What's your opinion? Does it make sense for countries to introduce their national ciphers, or is it indeed a waste of time?
A waste of time is, I think, too extreme. But I think we do better when we have fewer standards. And cryptography is something where you want the single well-tested thing that we all use. So, I mean, I would, were I advising before the process, I would say you probably want to adopt AES. If for no other reason that everything is using it already. Now you have a national standard. How do you get it in Microsoft products? How do you get it used in WhatsApp? How do you get it used in, I don't know, PKZip? And that's going to be hard. I think academic competitions are really valuable for spurring intellectual knowledge. I mean, one of the things you said is Ukraine is not known for its sort of cryptography, mathematical skills, but this is a way to get people to start paying attention and get graduate students to think about the math and cryptography. So in that way, it's kind of good. But in general, I think we are better with fewer standards. And I don't think the internet isn't national. The internet's international. So a national standard doesn't really fit the structure of the internet. The internet's going to, everybody, who's listening to me is using the security that's coming out of many countries in the world and international. We're using the cell phone systems that are international, using the internet protocols that are international. But it's going to be hard pressed to have a national Ukrainian cryptography standard implemented. And I think that's going to be the challenge.
That is true. Yes, adoption is for sure always harder compared to something that's already in there. I guess we try to simplify the people who actually chose this algorithm, among the others, decided to simplify this task by the fact that Kalina is actually based on AES and it can reuse the hardware implementation or hardware optimizations used on the processors made for AES for the implementation of Kalina.
You're right. Another reason to choose AES because Intel baked the instructions into their chips. So right. So using those primitives is valuable. But competitions in cryptography are a really good way to spur knowledge. And right now, NIST is having an international competition on PostQuantum Cryptography. So public key cryptography standards that will be resistant to a quantum computer. And I just this morning saw a presentation from NIST on how they chose their third round finalists. So, so this is something that is a worldwide competition run by the US, yes, but it's a worldwide competition for a standard. And I think when one is chosen, we should all use it. And it doesn't make sense for individual countries to do it again.
But it makes sense to have to develop ciphers. You're just talking about the standards, right?
Right. I think cipher design is really important, and it's something it
drives research. Yes.
To design them and break them and learn. I mean, that is really the most fun you can have as a cryptographer. So those competitions are good for that.
On this note, you actually mentioned post-quantum cryptography, and indeed we have standardization efforts going on, and it's been a little bit kind of hyped up in recent years with all the quantum threat and research driven in efforts to find algorithms that are resistant to quantum computer. But there are also already some companies that try to take the most promising algorithm, implement them, and already roll them out and market as we're quantum safe. Do you think it makes sense to already actually implement these systems and roll them out in adoption, even though the threat of quantum computer is still very far from being a threat to cryptography?
I don't think we really need to implement them today. I mean, NIST is doing their competition, I think, well ahead of the science of quantum computing. I think that's what we want, right? We don't want NIST to have to do this quickly. And because suddenly quantum computers are becoming mainstream and powerful and our security is vulnerable. We want NIST to do this process well before. So they can do it slowly and deliberately, and they are. This is a multi-year process, right? I said we're in the third round of algorithm selection, and there might be a fourth round before we pick one or two. That will become the standard. And I know companies are pushing their corporate algorithms and claiming that they are quantum safe. But right now, everything is quantum safe because there are no quantum computers that can do anything that factor like more than the number 35. So, we're not really worried about quantum computers yet. And I think quantum computers are years, possibly decades away. We really don't know the engineering difficulties in making practical quantum computers. We know they're considerable.
Some of the arguments.
I wouldn't deploy them just yet. I'd wait for the standard. But all those companies that are deploying now, when the standard comes, they're probably going to switch over. Because once the standard exists, everyone's going to want to use it.
Right. I guess my question was, even if the standard comes out, right, it's kind of hard to say that we're actually going to have threat from quantum computer anytime soon.
Once the standard's out, you might as well put it in your system. Because remember, what you don't want is, let's imagine you're Microsoft, you don't deploy the algorithm. 5 years later, suddenly there's a quantum threat, and now it's too late. It took Microsoft over a decade to get rid of their insecure hash functions because they're so deep into the code. So I think once the standard exists, we start using it, or at least having it as an option. So it's there that if the threat appears, we can flick a switch. We don't have to rewrite everything. So, we do want to deploy the algorithms well before the threat. That's going to be the safest for us.
And we also want to provide forward secrecy in case something gets encrypted and stays that way for a while until quantum computer actually may become an issue.
So that's right. Another reason. But yeah, I think NIST is doing a great process, and I'm excited to watch the winnowing as it's happening.
Absolutely, and it's great to have.
Probably tomorrow. There's a new report out of NIST that I just saw. I didn't have time, and I woke up, and it's way earlier where I am. I'm in Minneapolis. You were collecting where people are. So it was morning, but after this is done, I'm going to schedule the blog post.
Awesome. Yeah, it's actually literally happening as we speak. Ukraine isn't the only country that introduced new or updated their national standards for encryption, right? So we also had Russia, Belarus creating their ciphers. But for example, Russia proceeded to try to standardize their cipher in international body, in the ISO. And basically any country can do that. I guess that is totally fine. The problem in this case is that there were findings by Leo Perrin that this particular cipher had a hidden structure in their S boxes, which were claimed to be random. And the structure is similar to something that could be used, as was shown in previous works, to incorporate a backdoor in the cipher. So of course that caused some attention and suspicion, and it was later put on hold. But if not for this particular researcher who devoted his dissertation to S boxes and was able to actually discover this, it could go through, right? And as you mentioned and formulated in something that's now known as Schneier's law, right? It's very easy to create a cipher or come up with a new system, but it's very easy to actually analyze it because it's all very obscure to someone who didn't design it. So do you see, and we also had attempts from NSA, for example, some of them are successful to intervene in standardization and incorporate backdoors, of course. Do you still see this issue with standardization process that, is it still a threat to get a backdoor cipher standardized and then widely used and deployed?
I think much less today than it was years ago. So you mentioned the NSA, and that was the random number generator, the dual EC PRNG.
DRBG. Mm-hmm.
Right, which we believe has a backdoor and was in a standard. It was in a random number standard, and it was used in many systems. You mentioned the Russian. I think that was a GOST. I forget the number, and right? And that had S boxes that we were suspicious of. You had decades ago cell phone encryption standards that were less backdoored and more just weak. And that was because those processes happened in closed door meetings. They weren't open, and we didn't get to see it. And we're at a point now where I think the academic research in cryptography is robust enough that we're going to notice backdoor attempts. And even if it's things like, so if you look at both the Russian and the US, the NSA attempt, they were both in the fact that there were constants in the algorithm that we didn't know where they came from. And that is immediately suspicious. If there are numbers that are used and we're told we generated them randomly, trust us, we don't trust them. And so we know that. So it's a lot harder today to slip an algorithm in with a backdoor. It's not impossible. I mean, the NSA employs more mathematicians than anybody else in the world. They're going to have scientific knowledge that we don't. But I think their lead is not as great as it used to be. In the mid-70s, when they introduced DES, which did have a weakness that the NSA understood and the rest of the world didn't, it was 20 years before the rest of the world figured it out. If they do the same today, my guess is it'll be a year or 2 years. It's not long at all, which means it's not worth doing. So I think that we are more resilient against that kind of threat than we were in the 90s even.
It's true. I think we are definitely improving on this part. The gap between what's been what became a public knowledge and was secret before is much shorter now. Even in the older days, right, the public encryption was kind of co-created while there were also secret developings right on this. So in the United States, we have elections upcoming, right? And while in the US, it's a little bit weird, we have even debates on mail-in voting, but some countries had tried to implement electronic voting. And it doesn't seem like this is going to happen in the United States anytime soon, but some countries have already tried, and many people advocate that this is going to be, the next big thing that will kind of solve corruption problems and solve meddling issues from other countries and so on. But we are not there yet. It seems like we have all the pieces. We have algorithms and math. We have secure programming languages that kind of alleviate the entire classes of bugs. And we have ways to formally verify our protocols and test the libraries. If we would only just teach this all together, it seemed like we would have a working system that everyone could trust, but we don't. Why do you think there is, and what's the problem with things like electronic voting?
We don't have all the pieces, because we can't stitch together, because we cannot design a system that everyone trusts, because nobody who does election security thinks that's a good idea. And it's not just the program, right? So you have to trust the security of this entire object. And we know, we're at a HackerCon. There is no such thing as an unhackable system. Then we will not be able to design that. And it's very dangerous to have electronic voting. That whether they're computerized voting machines at polling places or voting via app or any of the systems being proposed, that would be an absolute disaster because it is hackable. Now, the reason it's hackable is because the vote is anonymous. If you had a system where the votes are public record, where your vote is made public, I can secure that very easily. Maybe we think of dozens of ways to secure that. That's not even hard, because the verification of it is easy. I look at the public record to make sure my vote is counted properly. But because we want a secret ballot, because we think that's critical to the democracy, you have to break the connection between whether you're allowed to vote and whether what you voted in a way that secure banking or secure anything else doesn't have to do. And that makes it very much an impossible problem for us to solve. So I worry about countries doing electronic voting. I think they're opening themselves up to enormous risks. I mean, and they might be countries so obscure nobody cares. They might not be. And I'm glad that we're not doing it in the United States. I don't think we're going to do it anytime soon. I think doing it will be a huge disaster. It'll make the security much worse in every possible way. It'll make election fraud much easier, whether done by large organized criminal groups or by other countries.
And more undetectable.
And much more undetectable. And that's a problem because elections serve two purposes, right? It's to pick the winner, but to convince the loser. And to the extent the loser doesn't agree with the result, we don't have an election people trust. And computerized voting removes that. And it's all dumb stuff. You'll see stuff on voting by blockchain, which is like the dumbest idea ever. Blockchain doesn't solve any problems we have in voting. It just makes other problems worse. And unfortunately, we're in a world where a paper ballot is the most secure way of voting.
You mentioned blockchain before I had a chance to, and I know you have skeptical views, like many cryptographers, about blockchain, because indeed it was, in many cases, it was overused. But do you think there is a use case that is legitimate for blockchain, and is it a good use in some cases?
I've never seen a legitimate use case for blockchain. I've never seen a system where blockchain provides security in a way that is impossible to provide any other way. And blockchain has a lot of baggage, a lot of problems, a lot of things that makes it hard and insecure and reasons not to do it. But if there's a benefit, then you have to weigh the benefits and costs. I have not seen any application where blockchain is essential. I've seen a lot of applications where blockchain is used because people like the tool and look for ways to use it. But I've seen no application where it's essential. Now, you can't do these digital currencies without blockchain. But if you look at the way the trust flows, I'm not convinced it's better than doing it the way we're doing it now with digital currencies, which is things like credit cards and PayPal and Venmo and all of those systems. I'm not convinced that they are less secure. I mean, yes, there's a whole lot of sort of crypto anarchists that like blockchain, but the world they envision actually isn't a more secure world. In a world where if you forget your password, you lose your life savings. Nobody wants that. A world where if you accidentally hit the wrong key, you lose your life savings and can't get it back. Nobody wants that.
I guess it decreases centralization, but it also decreases trust.
Centralization is actually valuable. We like dispute resolution. We like the ability to roll back transactions. I mean, that lets us trust commerce. The story a bunch of years ago that Wozniak lost something like $30,000 in Bitcoin in a transaction where he was just hoodwinked. Someone promised him something, he gave them the money, he didn't get the thing. And that's what Bitcoin does to you.
Yes, we also had a story, I believe, somewhere in Eastern Europe, where a person was basically just mugged of their password for the Bitcoin, and because he had a lot on his account, and you have a van, you have people to beat out the password of the person, and you steal their savings, and there is no claim you can file against the bank to return it.
That's not a trust system people are going to trust. The regular people aren't going to trust that. They're going to use PayPal. Right? They're going to use a credit card. They're going to use a bank. So yes, they're more centralized, but they're centralized for a reason, because that does provide security. Now, Bitcoin provides some other types of security, and now, which is better? And for pretty much everybody, the way we're doing it now is better.
Thanks for your view. The way we're in this format right now is, of course, because of COVID, and it influenced, multiple parts of our lives and the way we work, the way we communicate. What would you? Is there some most fundamental impact or shift that you could identify that COVID caused in terms of information security? What changed with the pandemic?
It's sort of interesting that so many things socially that we said would never happen has suddenly happened. Like working remotely, sort of all of these things. And so a lot more digital stuff is happening. So we have to worry about security, and they happen very fast. You saw that in Zoom, right? Zoom suddenly became, from this very little niche program that few people used to the platform that we are all on all the time. And their security took several months to catch up to their newfound popularity. And that was true for a lot of systems, that they're suddenly used to a greater degree, and there were insecurities that we had to fix quickly. And also, we started doing things differently. So the normal procedures aren't being followed anymore. And criminals took advantage of that. There were a lot more phishing attacks of the business email compromise variety, where the CEO sends you an email saying, we're not following normal procedures, but this is important. Please send this money to this account. Now, people fall for that, but people are suspicious. But in a COVID world where everything is different all the time, people are more likely to fall for those. We saw a rise in those types of frauds. We saw more insecurities because people are working from home. So suddenly they're not in their more secure business network. They're in their less secure home network. They're using unfamiliar tools. They're not configuring them properly. And maybe that's Dropbox, and maybe that's Zoom, and maybe that's some other collaboration tool,
Slack.
And they're not configuring them securely because they don't know, they don't have the experience. And that's led to and is leading to insecurities. So it's funny, I think really the rapid change in our socialization that caused a rapid change in our use of tech. And that added to insecurities in several different dimensions.
All of a sudden we switched to zero trust network, just basically overnight.
Without thinking about it first. Now, I'm a fan of zero trust networks, but we have to think it through. And there just wasn't time.
So many people call these new apps that we shift to do our jobs as critical infrastructure now. Do you agree with that? Do you think they are critical, and do we need to maybe incorporate some means of protecting them, maybe by regulation or anything like that? That would be typically the way to do with regular critical infrastructure, right?
I think there's a lot of arguments being made that much of the internet is critical infrastructure and should be regulated to a degree it is not today. And we could look at things like Facebook, which for many people are critical to how we socialize, how we get our news, how we get our information, social networks, internet protocols, cell phone networks, and some apps, right? Like the Zoom app where we're using. I think all of that needs a lot more regulation, but it's also even things you don't think of as critical. If you remember the Dying botnet, it turns out that DVRs and webcams are critical infrastructure. Because if you get the security wrong there, someone creates a giant botnet, attacks a domain name server, and suddenly 25, 30 popular critical websites are down. So the debate about critical infrastructures, I think, is complicated. Because it can't be everything, because that's just too much. So where do you draw the line? I tend to see the line drawn around the electricity grid, communications network, transportation, those critical pieces of infrastructure. Elections, I think, count as critical.
The foundations.
Right, but it turns out that the internet-connected toy you buy affects those systems. So, we really have to rethink how we regulate the internet. And what we're doing today, which is not regulating at all, I think doesn't sustain.
Right. So it seems like we're actually at the beginning of this, right? We have GDPR and also a similar in act in California to start protecting it, but it's still kind of a wild west for sure compared to more traditional industries. In terms of critical infrastructure, though, my observation has been that even though many people treat this whole situation we're in as a little bit of dystopia, that, oh my gosh, we quickly switch to all these apps which are unsecure, and we don't know how to securely configure them and so on. But the reality, it seems that when it comes to critical stuff, availability is more important than confidentiality from what I see. And it doesn't really matter if Zoom is such secure app or not. There are basically just some things happening, right? Someone gets Zoom bombed, some court hearing gets invaded by uninvited people, and it gets in the news, but nothing bad happens out of it. So do we care too much about security, maybe sometimes, at least about encryption and confidentiality?
So it's actually interesting. I mean, so normally there are three things you worry about: confidentiality, integrity, availability. That's called the CIA triad. And you're right. We tend to think primarily in terms of confidentiality, of data security. And when there's a security story in the news, it's a confidentiality story. And that's important, yes. But I think it's the change to the Internet of Things, to computers that affect the world in a direct physical manner, that make availability and integrity much more important. Right? So I'm worried about someone in my car. I'm worried about someone hacking it and turning on the Bluetooth microphone, eavesdropping on my conversations. But I'm really worried about them disabling the brakes. Right? That's a data availability attack. And I'm worried about them, hacking a hospital and getting my private patient medical records. But I'm really worried about them changing my blood type, the data integrity attack. So cars, medical devices, power systems, drones, weapons, appliances. Right? The real serious attacks are availability and integrity. But I think you're right. Doesn't mean confidentiality isn't important. We want to be able to have video conferences that are private. We need that ability. But yes, availability and integrity are becoming much more important as these things become more critical and as they become more physically capable.
So, of course, we do want to protect our privacy. And this is something that comes, always comes up, the social media problem and the privacy invasion that it creates, that it has to create, basically just because of the economic incentives and the business models that it operates in, right? And while most of other issues that we discuss, we kind of see the way how to deal with it, and it might take time, but we're quite optimistic that it'll smooth out and get sorted out over time. Do you think it's also the case with social media? Because it doesn't seem to get much better in the recent years.
No, so, I mean, there's sort of two problems. One is surveillance. I've written that surveillance is a business model of the internet, and as long as these social media companies use surveillance and persuasion as their business model, there are going to be all sorts of problems. And Shoshana Zuboff's written about that. I've written about that. The other half of it is that these are monopolies. And the fact that there's no competition is a huge issue, and I think causing a lot of the problems as well. So fixing it is two different things. I think we need to make it so that surveillance isn't the business model of the internet. That is a business model that is not sustaining and is not doing society well. You also need to bring back competition. And it can't just be it can't just be Facebook and a bunch of other things that Facebook owns. It can't just be YouTube and a bunch of other things that Google owns. That we actually need dozens of companies, open APIs, ways users have control. And that will actually solve a lot of problems if we really have competition in the social networking space, or social media space.
So can this be driven only by regulation, or are there any other means?
It is. I mean, the way you deal with monopolies in a market economy is through regulation. You don't allow them to exist. And I blame the United States here pretty much singularly. We are not enforcing our antitrust regulations. I'll blame the EU somewhat, but the US more. That we really need to enforce what is the law that we are not enforcing, and break up monopolies. I think that will do an enormous amount of good. And then there is the other half of dealing with surveillance as a business model, which is, I think, less about surveillance and more about manipulation. The discussion we're not really having, which is what sorts of manipulation are okay in society. Advertising is manipulation. Politics is manipulation. Some of that we think is okay, and some of that we think is not okay. We're really not clear on where the line is, and we need to be, because manipulation is getting very good.
Indeed. You mentioned that we want to own our data, and I think you're part of the project that kind of involved and worked in that direction. Could you tell about it?
Yeah, this is Tim Berners-Lee's sort of new project. It's called Solid, and it's really a system for personal distributed data ownership. The idea is that you would own your data in a data pod, it's called, a data bank, and that you would give people and organizations permissions to access, to change, to parts of your data. And it's a different way of thinking about data. I mean, right now, our data is stored by everybody. Right? My credit card data is at my credit card company, and my airline frequent flyer data back when I used to fly on airplanes was stored by my airline. And my medical data is stored by my insurance company or my doctor. And so it's very hard for me to control my data because I don't have any control over my data. If I have a Fitbit, the data is stored on the Fitbit server. But wouldn't it be better if all of those disparate pieces were brought to me, I stored them, and then Delta Airlines and Fitbit and my doctor and Facebook have access to it to do what they do? It's really a different way of thinking about data that would really change our relationship with these companies. I think it's very powerful. It's a moonshot. It's a big change, but it's Tim Berners-Lee, and he's not only brilliant, he's a visionary, and he really can see further ahead than other people. And it's been really interesting working with him. And I think
it sounds to me like decentralization done right, where you're in control of your data.
Is a way to think of it.
Thank you so much for this. I think we're nearing the end of our time slot, so I'd like for us to switch to some of the questions that we got in. And the first question is from GPL Mason, who actually, I think, either had been on earlier today on NoNameCon or after. And he is wondering if you're going to update your book, Protect Your Macintosh.
I am not. That is the book that died a quiet and lonely death. That was the second book I wrote, 1994. It is nothing like the world today. And no, I'm amazed he has a copy. There are very few copies in the world. That is a rare book.
We also have one question that is very cryptography related. And the question goes, what's your opinion on IRX ciphers? Is it future, especially in IoT world, or it's not safe enough? And just for our viewers, IRX is basically simplistic ciphers that only use additional rotation and XOR operations in their implementation.
The answer to any cryptography question is it depends, and that's the answer. If it's a good cipher, great. If it's a bad cipher, no. A lot of times, we're trying to optimize different things when we make ciphers. We're optimizing for speed, for size, for throughput. And there are a lot of applications sort of Internet of Things where speed doesn't matter. I mean, you think of my thermostat. If it takes a minute to encrypt a message, who cares? It's a thermostat. So you can invent ciphers that are very simple, but just very slow. They have 1,000 rounds, some crazy number, and it would be secure. So there's always going to be a place for ciphers that use a very simplistic instruction set, because maybe they're using this cheap 8-bit CPU that's deeply embedded into the head of a pin. And because they can handle slow, it's fine. So I would never categorically say these are going to be insecure. It always depends. You can design a secure cipher with a simple instruction set. And we have, and there are lots of examples of that. But think of it in terms of what you're optimizing. Are you optimizing code size? Are you optimizing throughput? Are you optimizing latency? What are you optimizing? And that'll sort of tell you what kind of cipher to use. Most of the time, I don't care. Right? On the phone, I have so much processing power, I'm not optimizing anything. It doesn't actually matter. But often as we move to these more niche applications, we are optimizing something.
Thank you for that answer. And the next one that we have is, it goes, Mr. Schneier, one of your famous quotes is complexity is the worst enemy of security. Do you still observe growing of this complexity? What are the ways of simplifying security nowadays, to your opinion?
I think it's true. We are still finding complex systems that are insecure because they're so complex. And the solution is to try to simplify. And we kind of know how to do it in software. It's modularization, it's hierarchies, libraries. We have a bunch of tricks, because it turns out that software complexity is a problem in all sorts of ways, not just in security. So we have ways of building highly complex systems that try to make things more simple. There are languages that let us code more simply, and those are all valuable. So I don't have a silver bullet, but yes, complexity is still the worst enemy of security, and simplicity is still hard.
And I think we're moving towards simplicity. Actually, if you take in TLS 1.3, for example, which simplified the cipher suite and kind of moved from agility to just defining strict combinations of algorithms that are used. So I think, we are, while things become more complicated, we strive for simplicity in the protocols that we use, for sure.
And I think that's a great example. I mean, don't give users options, because they'll just mess it up. Tell them what to do.
Yep, that's also one of the mottos of the company where Anastasia works. So,
but there you are with a problem with a Ukrainian national standard. That how do you incorporate that in a system where I want to give users fewer options?
Right. It's well, I think the use case for the national standards are always a little bit different, especially when it comes to countries which don't have a chance of actually driving it to international level, right? And because basically what's been accepted in the United States get accepted worldwide usually.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion to have. What do countries that are almost technology consumers, and how can they have a voice? I think we have a bad world if the United States dictates what everybody gets. I mean, if you get the Facebook that the United States decides you get, I mean, that's not good. We really need a way to think about how, it's not just the Ukraine, it's countries like Australia and Japan and France. I mean, these are big, powerful countries, and they have no power over Facebook. Although, I don't know, Australia seems to be doing something with Facebook and news. So we should watch that and see what happens.
Yes, what I can tell is that national ciphers definitely create an internal market for special hardware that gets produced and sanctioned by the government.
That might be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Yes. As always, the answer is it depends. So before we wrap up, do you have any words of advice you'd like to give to Ukrainian InfoSec community, and especially to the young enthusiasts who are striving to become professionals in the future?
Well, so I think this is the most exciting area in computers to work. I've always enjoyed it. It's great fun. And there's enormous demand. This is not an area that is going away. You can read about the cybersecurity skills shortage in pretty much any magazine. There's going to be a lot of work and interesting things to work on. So stay here. I mean, pick up skills. I'm asked often, what area should I study? They're all good. Pick the area you like. Be broad. Security is a way of thinking, and it's powerful and useful and something we all need. And it'd be great if we can do this in person next year.
Absolutely, it would be incredible. Before ending, I couldn't help but ask about this one now. So many people know about Chuck Norris facts, which are hyperbolic, kind of exaggerated claims about the power and the abilities of Chuck Norris. But I think fewer know that there are also Bruce Schneier facts. And there is a website dedicated to that. I know you're aware of it because it was published on your blog post as well. Do you have a favorite Bruce Schneier fact?
Wow. God, there's some really good ones.
There are indeed. If I understand that this is
I mean, some of them are kind of dumb. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them are dumb. But some of them are some really funny math jokes. And there is, I think, a best button where you can get the 10 best.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not remembering, but go there. There's a lot that are really dumb, but some of them are very, very funny.
Absolutely. I can tell two of mine favorites, which
I hear your favorites.
One related to cryptography and one to security in general. So first one goes, Bruce Schneier once beat an asymmetric cipher into symmetry. And the one on security goes, Bruce Schneier doesn't need full vulnerability disclosure because he already knows.
Right. Right. Another one similar to that is Bruce Schneier doesn't need a password guessing program. He's standing right behind you.
Absolutely. So watch out. Mr. Schneier, thank you so much for your conversation. It's been a pleasure. And best of luck in all of your future endeavors, and stay safe.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having this con online. I know we're all doing the best we can. I really appreciate these online events. It helps us get some community when it's so hard. Stay safe.
Yeah, and to connect to each other, and imagine after we will have offline events, we already will have some friends and these connections from online events, right? So we can visit all the cities because we already know the people. And Mr. Schneier, I actually wrote that you tell that maybe next year you can be here in Ukraine. So we'll write it down.
It's a long time since I've been.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful. A lot of thoughts, a lot of useful quotes.